Everyone wants to innovate, but nobody wants to change. I think that's probably why. Again, a very human problem. This too, I think, is going to be a headwind for AI. It's that we don't want to change. Like, we love the idea of it, but when it comes right down to it, we don't actually want to change what we do.
Hi, I'm Andy North. Welcome to Velocitize Talks. I'm joined today by Oonie Chase, Executive Creative Director at Frog Design San Francisco headquarters. Oonie, thank you so much for joining us.
It is my pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about your role at Frog Design and what's going on with the company and what some of the exciting things you're working on.
We work really across the spectrum of design. So any place where design as a problem-solving practice can be brought to bear on something, we are working in it. If it's in the digital space or the physical space or even in the human space. So we have started working with lots of organizations who need help.
Being more human?
Well, yeah, sure, being more human, but also kind of building capacity and resilience as they look to innovate or to respond to some of the disruption that's happening in their markets.
Given that there is so much noise in the marketplace from a marketing standpoint, is UX able to differentiate a brand? And if so, how so?
Not to get too highfalutin, but I think at its core, UX is about acknowledging human dignity. And so when a brand or a company decides to make that its charter and make that the way that it's going to interact with its customers, there's automatically an elevating of the relationship between the brand and its customers. I think people, as we've seen, like, people are demanding far more from the companies that they do business with, and companies are realizing that you can have the best brand campaign in the world, but it means nothing if your user experience doesn't meet the promise of what you're saying about who you are in the market. So the more that a company can look to being attentive to what their customers are needing, being respectful of them, and giving them something of true value, I think that's going to make brands win.
Given that UX is sort of the leading edge of trying to be more human for these brands, are there any out there that are good examples or that might be leading the charge that come to mind?
Actually, 2 points in that. One is, I think companies who want to recenter themselves around user experience do not need to become more human, they need to become more human-friendly, which is a distinction, because I think when a company tries to be human-like or human, sometimes it doesn't feel hugely authentic. It feels like they're trying to be your bud, when people don't want a brand to be their bud. People don't want to be in a community with a brand. You know, traditional ideas of brand loyalty or brand love are kind of falling away, or at least being shifted, where people are like, what does it look like for a brand to love me versus, or a brand being loyal to me, as opposed to the traditional thing of a brand being the other way around. Anyway, setting that aside, for us at Frog, we work with large companies, getting briefs on how to recenter themselves around user experience. We also have a ventures arm, so we work with small startups who are just looking to get their sea legs, and they're either building a product or figuring out what their brand is, and we work with them. And I think it's those companies that are kind of at the leading edge of what end-to-end user experience could look like, and what a true service, a well thought out service design experience could be. And that's because they don't have the traditional departments that you have in big companies. You know, it's very fluid between marketing and product, and all of these things are all munged together. And so they're able to move faster, they're able to try things quicker, they're able to fail faster, and then respond to those in real time.
You've mentioned some of the larger brands. You've worked with companies like Apple. What is it like working? What's the difference in working with sort of those global brands, those globally recognized brands who are still trying to get their secret sauce down right, versus some of these smaller startups who may not know what they don't know yet, and so they're just experimenting? What's that experience like working on both sides? Because you do work with some of the larger brands and then startups.
Larger brands are much more of an organizational design problem. You have very, very ambitious people inside of big companies who are, I would say, more or less comfortable in their role. And so the cadence of working with a larger brand is very, very different. Smaller companies, smaller startups are, they're toddlers in the best of ways. They're like a enfant terribles. Terrible? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
They just, they're not as risk averse. And so they're kind of leaning forward into their product and leaning forward into the market and more willing to cast away, like inherited wisdom and things like that. But the big brands are captivating because, one, because of the organizational design problem. Two is because you have a very, very mature level of leadership in those companies, and they're working at a scale that is sometimes mind-boggling. And so the kind of problems that they're having to address, or the kind of risks they're having to think about and mitigate, is like order of magnitudes different than a startup. So they're both super juicy.
So artificial intelligence is sort of the new 800-pound gorilla. Not necessarily new, but it's certainly making its impact in the marketing world. That and machine learning, obviously. That leads to the amount of data that goes into artificial intelligence. You've talked about a paradox of trust when it comes to using that data, creating that trust, particularly in artificial intelligence. Talk a little bit about that and what your thoughts are on how do we get there?
The paradox of trust is a notion that Karen Giefer, who's the executive director of applied data at Frog, and I are writing about for Frog's Tech Trends this year. It posits that you cannot trust something unless you understand it. And you can't really understand something unless you trust it, even a little bit. And AI is invisible to us. It's not clear from whence its intelligence arises. It's not clear if you can turn it off. And we've been used to computational intelligences being quite visible to us in our phones, on our screens, on tablets, and having, it might have been a false sense of security, but the security of being able to turn it on and off. But AIs, you can't really do that. It's very, very squishy. And together with that, we now have the image of Zuckerberg in front of Congress, admitting to perhaps not having been a good steward of data. So now people are starting to realize that their data has value, that they've been giving it away for free, and they've been giving it away without a sense of how it's being used, and sometimes potentially it's being used not in service of their own interests. So I think this is a moment of customers waking up to additional agency they have that they didn't realize that they had before. And on the other side, brands needing to make data in a way the currency of brand trust. So how do you earn somebody's data? Which means you have to design things that use that data in a way that's useful and not just a flashbang or flashbang meaning something that seems fun and whiz-bangy, but doesn't deliver value in any sustainable long-term way.
It's interesting. We've done some studies around Generation Z in particular. We studied all 4 generations, but particularly with Generation Z, which is the generation born from 1996 to roughly 2015. Yeah. Because they've grown up as digital natives, they are more willing to give their data to have a more personalized experience, whether it's your playlist on Spotify or your viewing list on Netflix. Are you seeing that willingness somewhat to part with that data in order to have that more personalized experience?
Yes, but I think what we're also seeing, or our clients are seeing, is a little bit of a headwind that just in the last year, people are being a little bit more skeptical and perhaps a little bit less willing to blithely part with their data in the way that they've been doing that. I think the other thing that we're also seeing generationally is at the top end, millennials, who are the original generation who was just, giving away data and had a very complicated relationship with privacy. Well, now they're having kids. And this, I think we're also starting to see that generation shift a little bit in their relationship to privacy and data. So it's quite new. As I say, it's just something that I think our clients have been seeing this year. So I'm not entirely sure whether people are just going to forget about it or whether we're going to increasingly see people demanding more of the brands that they choose to do business with.
Jumping back to design, you've talked about design being akin to being in a relationship.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that. How do you see that? I think that's an interesting parallel.
Yeah. I'm going to relate it to branding. I'm going to start there. There's a part of branding, and I think some of the big advertising agencies do this really well, where it's the big reveal. It's like the big first date. It's this sexy, Old Spice guy. You can't get it out of your head. It's the crush. And that, in many ways, when people think about branding, they think about that. Design it can be very sexy. Like any relationship can be sexy, but I think at the heart of the design is a willingness to do the work of all these small, unsexy, attentive moments and build that relationship over time. This is why I think user experience in design has always been the heart and soul of what we call branding. It's always been the heart and soul of building that gut feeling of trust, which is really, at the end of the day, what branding is. It's because you're paying attention to all of these moments, every single interaction and touch point, and using that to build into a great relationship.
You mentioned before that innovation is not something like a light switch. It's not something that you can just go into a new agency and say, I want innovation. It's a grind. It's blood, sweat, and tears.
It is.
Why is that?
Why is that? Well, because humans don't like to change. Everyone wants to innovate, but nobody wants to change. I think that's probably why. Again, a very human problem. This too, I think, is going to be a headwind for AI. It's that we don't want to change. Like, we love the idea of it, but when it comes right down to it, we don't actually want to change what we do. And so when an organization comes to Frog and they say, we want to innovate, we want to become more innovative, and then they buy us for 12 weeks, it's a little bit of a
tip of the iceberg?
It's a little bit of a tip of the iceberg, and it's a little bit of a tokenism in a way. Like, we're going to buy innovation, dag nabbit. But you don't. It's a practice. It's an unsexy practice. It is a slog, and it means that your organization, everything from how you staff to how you incent to your strategy and how that pushes out through the rest of your organization, and yes, into your products and services and marketing and advertising and all of that kind of stuff, all of it, but it has to start in how you are shaped, how you're incented, and how you're structured. And that doesn't sound as interesting as we were innovative and we launched this new thing into the world.
Let's talk a little bit about radical empathy, which I don't know if you coined, but I'm going to give you credit for.
No, God, no, I didn't coin it. No.
Define it in your terms and tell our viewers a little bit about what it means in the UX and branding and design world.
Radical empathy existed way outside of Frog, and it was used as a way for people to reach across a belief divide or an ideological divide and understand the perspective of someone who's coming from a completely other perspective or has never had the same kind of experiences that you do. And we had, it came into Frog through a team of women who were redesigning the speculum. And they were doing it on their own time. And they noticed that they weren't getting a lot of love from some of their male counterparts in the studio. And so they set up an exercise in radical empathy. So what it involved was a woman narrating to her male counterpart what it was like to have a pelvic exam, and then to have him then narrate it in the first person back to her. And so in doing so, he is needing to embody in many ways the feelings that she had as a part of the exam.
With active listening and mirroring and so forth.
All of that, yeah. And when you have to narrate something back in the first person, it changes the orientation of your brain, and your brain starts to look like the brain of someone who has gone through this experience. And so when you do that, you start to change perspectives in a really, hearty way, and I'm using that word in the fullest extent of it, is you're making someone feel the vulnerability or feel what that feels like. And so we've adopted this practice in a few different forums. We've used it in workshops where people are wanting to come in and sort of break down some of the divides. We've used it with clients or different parts of clients' organizations who are very entrenched in their perspective or biases. And we've used it between clients and customers, where again we have brands who have, what I sometimes call lore, a set of beliefs that maybe were true at one time but aren't true anymore, and customers who have raced right past that lore and are living in a very different world. And how do you bring these two people together and build that empathy?
So many brands today are taking an active stance, whether they are forced into it or they feel like they need to. Can brands stay on the sidelines and remain neutral anymore? Or do they need to come at their brand, their audience, with a certain perspective of this is who we are and this is what we stand for?
I don't think there's any brand out there that is neutral. The way that a company operates in the world is its point of view. You can't not be judged by your behavior. Where in a culture where corporations are considered to have personhood, then we can absolutely judge companies by their behavior. So I think the notion that a brand can remain neutral is, it's a comforting fantasy. So now inside of that, there's some brands, Nike, Patagonia, and others, who are choosing to make that stand a core part of their brand. And there are others who are choosing to stay in the fiction of neutrality.
My guest today has been Oonie Chase, Executive Creative Director at Frog Design's headquarters here in San Francisco. Oonie, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.